The recording of this session is beginning now. I'd like to welcome you all again to our penultimate, second to last session. I'm very eager to hear your presentations today. They're going to be between 5 and 7 minutes long, and then we'll have 5 to 7 minutes of discussion. And we're going to start with Victoria Heredia Ferran. And while she is presenting, I'm also going to start the process to make sure all of you are co-hosts so that you will be able to share your screens. Victoria already has that capacity. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen now. I do apologize. I think you will be seeing the tabs during the presentation, but that should be it. Can everybody see my screen well?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So this is the European Green Deal Research Project, and my focus was sustainable mobility. My name is Victoria Heredia Ferran. I am a senior at U of I, studying management in the international concentration, as well as marketing and Spanish. So the goals of the sustainable mobility strategy listed by the European Green Deal are to create a sustainable, smart, and resilient environment for the EU and the world overall. Their main goal is to achieve a 90% cut in emissions by 2050. And this is being led by the Commission, which has presented its plan for 2021 for the green, smart, and affordable mobility. The actions that they actually have 82 different initiatives in 10 key areas. And I listed the top 4, which they are focusing on, which include installing 3 million charging points by 2030. At the moment, they already have 1 million, but this was done by companies like Tesla and Volvo. So they haven't even done any steps themselves. They've been using the private sector to accomplish that goal. The next one is developing train and cycling infrastructure. They're trying to make sure that there is a reliable, sustainable way of transportation throughout the EU, including this 10E regulation, which is in charge of the EU guidelines for new energy infrastructure. The third is pricing carbon and providing incentives. They're doing this by making sure that people have less of a reason to use cars because of the taxes that are imposed on them, as well as businesses that have limited carbon emissions, and kind of getting them to look at more eco-friendly options instead of using fossil fuels. The fourth big initiative is setting up transport safety and security. This includes actions such as setting up a smart traffic system, which would be able to kind of control city regulation of cars and make it safer and more secure for everybody on the road, as well as meeting climate goals by limiting the carbon emissions being thrown on the street. So next is financing. So there is a EU budget for the 2021 to 2027, which has 22.8 billion allocated to environment and climate action. However, they use the CEF, Connecting Europe facility, as the main financing instrument for EU infrastructure. And this money goes to further investment from both public and private sectors. And as you can see on the chart, 16 billion is going to rail. This is where they're putting most of their focus on, because this is what they want to use for transport of goods and people. And then they're also putting a significant amount, almost 2 billion on road, 1.6 billion on air, 1.4 in waterways, etc. They're also doing a few other ways of a user pays approach for financing. This includes road charging, which is taxation on vehicles and fuel. So that is completely for the end user who is polluting. They are getting taxed for polluting. So this incentivizes them to pollute less. They're also ending subsidies on fossil fuels and extending emission trading, which means that airlines who currently have been kind of getting a freebie, a free pass on their carbon emissions will no longer be getting that free pass and will have to pay. And that money will be going to funding the projects proposed by many different people throughout the EU to get a greener sustainable mobility. So the strengths and weaknesses that I identified, the strengths where there's growing social motivation, people are more aware of how their traveling is affecting the environment and they're willing to look at alternatives. The projects receive sufficient attention and funding. They have a really good website where you're able to see exactly where grants are going, and you can also put your own proposal up to receive a grant. And the communication is really well structured. Again, the website is very clear and it's organized very well. You can divide it by country, divide it by mode of transportation, and that makes it easy for someone to learn. Weaknesses is they have limited technology at the moment. They are not able to do everything in their action plan simply because it doesn't exist. So they want to have carbon neutral planes in the air, in the market by 2035, and that's something that doesn't exist. So it's not something they can promise until they are able to create it. And also right now with the alternatives that are eco-friendly are less convenient. And that gives, even though there's a growing social motivation, these people still might not want to take a 14-hour train when they could just fly for 3 hours. So they need to change that mindset of just the consumer, the end user. And finally, best practices. So the two highlights of best practices that they've been using are communication and funding. For communication, they have action weeks, for example, Mobility Week, where they have different events throughout the EU, which has actually right now 40 countries, which have events outdoors because of COVID, but they usually would have them indoors as well, promoting different grants, proposals, and getting people interested and educated, as well as this year is the year of rail, where they're going to be focusing on promoting rail transport and hoping that more people see that as a real alternative. Funding, they have the taxing that I mentioned earlier, as well as constant calls for proposals, and all these proposals are seemingly being addressed, so that way it is actually realistic for people to be able to execute a project. For technology, they're relying a lot on private companies and not so much on their own structure. So that's why they have these grants, so that they can give money and subsidies for companies that are taking these initiatives, and then the disincentivizing the carbon. Also for policy, the Commission is creating those regulations that we talked about in earlier sessions about kind of limiting carbon emission cars on the streets, and some cities already have implemented, how eco-friendly your car has to be if you want to have it on the road, and those are the main policies that are affecting the end user. So that is my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I'll take any questions now.
Victoria, do you have time to take questions, or would you like us to submit them to you in writing?
I can probably answer one if you have one, or I can just answer them in writing. That way I don't just have to answer one.
Would someone like to ask our gold standard one question we have available before Victoria has to go on to class? I want to make a comment. In the policy area, in best practices, we have the Commission regulating. And when I see that, I think of the climate law that is being negotiated right now. I wrote about that in my comments about best practices for policy, and have this sense that something like competition is in play right now with, for example, the EU and the United States trying to be global leaders in climate change policy. And there's that summit coming up on the 22nd of April, which is Earth Day this year, hosted by the United States. And I have the strong sense that the European Union is really trying to get as much of its EU climate law done so that it can brag about that and also just get on with it in the spring of 2021. At the same time, I think the United States, mark my words, is going to make some kind of big announcement at that Earth Day summit, and it likely will be related to the status of the infrastructure and climate change package of bills that are in the House of Representatives, just moving through the process of perhaps being passed by the 22nd of April. That means we're living in exciting times, and it's going to have a big impact on sustainable mobility. I'd like to thank Victoria for her questions and for joining us just before her class at 11. And we will submit our questions to you in writing and give maybe some input for final work on your written report. Thank you very much, Victoria.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. And we're going to continue now in the V category with Vikram. Vikram, please unmute, and the floor is yours.
Yep, I'll just share my screen. Can you guys see it or?
Yes, we can.
All right, so I'm going to talk about the EU clean energy transition. And my name is Vikram. I'm a junior at the university. And to start with, the goals are that it should be climate neutral by 2050, and the EU energy system accounts for like 75% of the EU's GHG. So the goal is to make a more efficient and interconnected energy sector driven by the twin goals of a cleaner planet and a stronger economy. What I mean by system integration is that the production and consumption, they're both connected in the sense that the electricity to fuel electric cars will come from solar panels on a roof, while the buildings to keep the buildings warm, the energy will come from a nearby factory, and the factory will be powered by renewables. So they're more like interconnected and linked. That's what it means. And what actions will achieve these goals? There are like three basic blocks. The first is a more circular energy system. It has energy efficiency at its core, and it aims to use local energy sources to power buildings and communities, while also reusing waste heat from industrial site. The second block is direct electrification of end use sectors. This means electrifying cars, so basically electric cars, and also using electric furnace in certain industries. To achieve this change, a visible goal will be to achieve a network of 1 million electric vehicle charging points, and also expanding solar and wind power. The third block is providing clean fuels to sectors where electrification is difficult. So some sectors just can't be electrified due to a lot of reasons. So they're going to provide a renewable hydrogen and sustainable biofuel and biogas to these industries. How are these actions financed? There are two financing mechanisms. The first is the next generation EU recovery uh, instrument. It's a multi-annual financial framework having over 7 years period. It has a total of 750 billion funds located. The fund is not only for a clean energy transition; it's for the overall EU budget, and it aims to contribute to a green, digital, and resilient recovery of the economy. The second mechanism is EU Renewable Energy Financing Mechanism. Uh, it works in a different way. It links countries that voluntarily pay into the mechanism, that's the contributing countries, with countries that agree to have new projects built on their soil, hosting countries. And this diagram kind of illustrates this process. You guys can see it. Okay, to move on to strengths and weaknesses of the actions and financing. To start with strength, no sectors are left behind since hydrogen is used. So decarbonizing the sector is going to be easy and achievable. And the benefits of clean energy transition are clearly mentioned in the website. So for any common reader who reads it, they understand the benefits and be more willing to act towards it for change. And also they have uh, identified relevant sectors and steps to implement. This is crucial because they know what they're going to do and they just need the exact policy measures to act, which is a weakness because I've mentioned here that the exact policy measures have not been formulated. They're still underway. So I think this process should speed up for an efficient implementation. And for other weakness, I feel it's going to be complex to integrate the energy system with RE and hydrogen. It's going to be risky because renewable energies don't always produce energy, and hydrogen is still in the developmental stages. So it's going to be complex, and this is going to have a lot of high upfront cost, which I felt was a weakness to it. And to move on to best practices, I found 4 best practices with what Professor has sent us. I picked some of his uh, articles out. For communication, Green Deal call in 4 days like a virtual event where it aims to empower citizens. They all like come together and they contribute to the Green Deal, like what actions can be taken. So yeah, it says here participatory identification of solutions contributing to the European Green Deal. So the citizens are engaged and they feel more ownership to the Green Deal. So it kind of okay. To move on to funding, to achieve the clean energy transition faster, not only the government funds are not enough, we need more private investments coming in. And there's a good example of a Nordic based pension funds uh, who have raised almost 1.5 billion euros. So this is like a good thing, and I feel others should also follow this to make a to make the transition faster and quicker. And to start with policy, EU has a energy labeling and eco design legislation. So what it does is it sets a minimum standard to eliminate least performing products from market. So this not only saves consumers household energy bills, but also it has estimated to bring uh, energy savings up to 230 million tons of oil equivalent by 2030. Lastly, technology. As I said, hydrogen is an important part of the clean energy transition and is still in developmental stages. So it has to be implemented in a phased approach. So starting in 2020 to 2024, the EU will install 6 gigawatt of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers. And then in the next 5 years, it will increase the capacity to 40 gigawatt. And then finally to deploy at a larger scale to sectors where it's hard to decarbonize. So that's it on my side. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Vikram. And we this time have several minutes for at least a couple of questions. And I refuse
Should I stop,
to, Vikram,
or should I stop sharing my screen or?
uh, keep your presentation up there for the time being. we may ask you to go to a specific slide.
Mhm.
Who would like to ask the first question? Our time is precious, so I'm going to, if no one asks a question in 5 seconds, so Lingfei, thank you very much.
Yeah, I think I have a question like for the page 2. I think you mentioned the twin goals, and I would like to know what exactly are they? Like what the twin goals for cleaner planet and economy, maybe?
Oh,
Yeah.
just twin goal. The EU strives to have a cleaner planet while also having a stronger economy. So these two are like motives for the clean energy transition. Uh, yeah. Does that answer your question? They're like motives and goals. That's like a cleanup plan means no CO2 emissions, and a stronger economy means that are resilient from climate change and stuff. So they're more
Okay.
resilient.
Okay.
While we're
thank
on
you.
that slide, I'd like to ask quickly what GHG means.
Greenhouse gas.
Oops, thank you very much. Who would like to ask another question?
I can. I had a question about the best practices slide, and I was curious if you saw any of these as examples that could be implemented in a US context, and yeah, if you see them being able to transition here as well.
Yeah, I think that would be like these three things. Because I think for the first communication, I thought even the citizens should be part of a climate change transition. So I think the US should be more involving its citizens for like drafting legislation and stuff like that. And also for funding, I think a lot of firms in the US who are investing in clean energy and stuff. So it's already happening here, but I think it's happening on a larger scale, so the transition could be achieved quicker. And for this part, I think the US already has this. Some products have them, but not all of them. So I think the US should implement this policy called energy labeling, so that to mostly all products, from like hair dryer to your laptop to everything, so consumers are more aware of their energy usage and can even save their energy bills. So I think this should be implemented there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you again, Vikram. It's possible in some of these cases, and this also applies to me, that some of what we can see on the best practices page exists in the United States. And it could be that in that case, we would assert that the United States decision makers could do a better job of communicating information about all of this to us. And for example, in the case of funding, this is not only the government, but also private industry. My understanding is that all 6 of the biggest banks in the United States have committed to zero carbon neutrality by 2050. And it's unlikely that many of us, including me, know much about that. But it's also our responsibility, I think, to learn more about what is happening in the United States. And the necessity exists for all of us as US citizens to make sure that when pledges are made, that those pledges are kept. I think that's going to be a big challenge as we go through what is happening in the European Union and consider what is happening in the United States, understanding that pledging seems to be the rage right now. Everybody is pledging, but who's going to follow through? And the responsibility also resides to a certain extent with us. which I consider too to be a real virtue of our research project. I think each and every one of us is positioning ourselves better, not only to be more responsible citizens, but to lead groups of citizens in the process of assuring accountability with the pledges that are being made moving forward. We're now going to move on to Chris, who's going to talk to us about renovation and buildings.
Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes,
Awesome.
we can.
So my name is Christian Piton. I am a senior at the University of Illinois, and I am majoring in integrated biology and earth, society, and environmental sustainability. And today I'm going to be talking about the building and renovation, which is part of a European Green Deal research project that I am taking part of at U of I. And so we're first going to begin by talking about what are the goals of building and renovation within the EU Green Deal. And so the EU has come up with the renovation wave strategy, which basically is renovating private and public buildings to allow the EU to reach their climate neutrality by 2050. And then they're going to do this by doubling the annual energy renovation rates within the next decade. And by doing this, that means that they will renovate over 25 million homes across Europe. And then also another goal that they're going to do by renovating all these buildings is create an additional 160,000 jobs within the construction sector. And this is really important because buildings are responsible for 40% of the total energy consumption within the EU. So it's a really big area that needs to be tackled in order to reach their goal of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And there's a lot of like mini goals that they set forth within the renovation wave strategy to achieve this main goal of theirs, but then they set 3 like kind of sub goals within their strategy. And these 3 main sub goals are 1, tackling energy poverty and the worst performing energy buildings across Europe. And then 2, building or public buildings such as educational, healthcare, and administrative facilities will be tackled first before like residential homes and residential buildings. And then thirdly, the decarbonization of heating and cooling systems, which is probably the most important because heating and cooling is responsible for 80% of the energy consumed within infrastructure. And then moving on, the renovation wave strategy has set forth a lot of critical actions within their document that they have published. And so it's titled Renovation Wave for Europe, Greening Our Buildings, Creating Jobs, and Improving Lives. And within it, they identify 7 critical actions. And I'm going to just talk about some of the sub actions within those 7 critical ones. And probably one of the most important ones is revising the energy performance of building directives, which is titled EPBD. And by doing this, they're going to ensure that all buildings within the next decade are going to reach nearly zero energy consumption. And then another part of this is having 2 objectives, which is 1, accelerating the renovation of existing buildings, and then 2, including smart technology and a cleaner link to mobility within these buildings. And then another one of their goals that they would like to achieve, or actions in order to achieve their goals, is through the European Local Energy Assistance titled ELENA. And this is going to increase technical assistance across Europe so that citizens and corporations are better able to implement the renovation projects. And then the next goal or action has to do with achieving or helping energy poverty across Europe. And so they're going to develop neighborhood-based approaches for communities to utilize renewable energy instead of non-renewable energy, and then create these zero energy districts. And then in order to achieve this, they're going to create the Affordable Housing Initiative, AHI, for 100 districts. And then they have released relatively recently the Commission recommendation on energy poverty, which is just how to tackle the 34 million people across Europe that are experiencing energy poverty. And then nextly, the revision of Renewable Energy Directive titled RED and Energy Efficiency Directive titled EED is really, really important in order to achieve their goals, because it will promote the decarbonization of heating and cooling, which going back is 80% of the energy consumption within buildings. And then just some of the building projects that they have created to achieve some of their goals is the Build Up Skills Initiative, which is creating some of the green jobs within the construction industry. And then the 4R in EU, which encourages large scale renovations instead of just like tackling things over a long period of time, just very slowly. And it will ensure that it happens over more quickly, I would say. And then how these actions are financed. So it's estimated that approximately 275 billion euros is needed to be invested every single year in order to reach the proposed climate target of 55% by 2030. The main source of funding is going to be coming from Next Generation EU, which is temporary funding due to COVID and everything. And it's going to bring in about $750 billion that is going to be allocated in different areas. And then within the Next Generation EU, they have something called the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which is titled the RRF. And this is going to make up 672.5 billion of the 755 billion funding. And 37% of this is going to go towards renovating and improving buildings across Europe. And then another really important funding that the EU has come up with is called Invest EU, which is going to bring about $5.6 billion towards infrastructure renovations. And then React EU is another one, which will bring 47.5 billion. And then finally, the Just Transition Fund, which will bring about 10 billion. And there's a lot of other like public funds, private funds, and like funds from the EU that are going to be used to achieve the actions. But these are just the most the biggest issues of funding. And then some of the strengths and weaknesses of the actions in financing. I said improving energy performance will lead to reduced energy consumption overall, improved air quality, and a higher level of comfort across Europe. The securement of energy for 34 million people experiencing energy poverty is another strength. And then the creation of 160,000 jobs in the construction sector to stimulate the economy. And then some of the weaknesses are there are a lack of or limited resources to finance the renovations. Another one, lengthy process with extremely long paybacks, which depends on the building. So public buildings, so like administrative buildings, hospitals, schools are going to take way longer to get your payback because they're going to require more investments into the buildings versus like private homes, residential homes, which are going to be cheaper, and then you're going to get your payback in a shorter amount of time. And then some of the regulatory obstacles make distributions of the funds difficult across different member states. And then the coordination of many stakeholders is really complex. And so that's another weakness, because going back to the funding, it's really hard to distribute that across all the member states. And then some of my best practices that I mentioned. So for communication, I said that green filmmaking would be really important for building and renovations, because it could show people how they can obtain funding for the renovations. And then a lot of people are unaware of like the advantages and like exactly how long it's going to take for them to get back their money, or like exactly how this is going to improve or get them out of energy poverty and stuff like that. And then for funding, I said that targeted government research and development investment is the most important practice. And so an example of this is EU countries need to create a clear national recovery and resilience plan in order to receive the funding that I mentioned before called RRF, which is the most important funding. So if countries don't create these clear recovery plans and resilience plans, then they're not going to receive the funding, which I think is like a really good practice, because it goes to show, okay, if you don't have a plan on how you're gonna start this process towards renovating all these buildings, then you're not going to get the appropriate funding to do it, because other countries have a more thought out plan and they're going to have priority for funding over you. And then for policy, I said that standardization of contracts and financial instruments at the national and European level is really, really important because it's going to lead to an overall decrease in the cost of renovations, which when you're talking about billions and billions of dollars, you really need to cut costs as much as you can. And so standardizing it across the member states will allow more fairness, I would say, and then just more equal costs for each project that a country is going to try to implement. And then finally, the best practice for technology, I said to promote comprehensive and integrative renovations for smart buildings that measure energy consumption. And so some of the smart technology includes smart readiness indicators, SRIs, which will basically say how much energy that your building is using, and then it will be put into a database that compares it to other buildings and shows like, okay, is this actually effective? Is it actually reducing my energy consumption? Are we working towards our main goal of decreasing by 50%, 55% energy consumption by 2050, stuff like that. And then another one is the building renovation passports, which just goes to show it's another way of keeping track if you're making progress towards smart renovations. And that's it.
Bruce, thank you very much. I'd like you to keep your presentation on screen. And we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Who would like to be first? Chris, you mentioned just transitions a couple of times in your presentation. Do you see overlap between what you're doing and what Reagan is focusing on? And if so, does that seem good or bad or a mix?
I've seen a little bit when she talked about her PowerPoint before. I know that only some of the funding from that mechanism is being used for the renovation wave strategy, but I would say that I think it's really good because that is the one type of funding that's really going towards ensuring that those experiencing energy poverty are the ones that aren't left behind. And that's like one of the most important goals, I would say, currently of the renovation wave strategy is ensuring that those people are the ones that are getting help, because ultimately it's gonna, if we help those experiencing energy poverty, it's gonna create the most progress towards decreasing our energy consumption. So I would say, yeah, that one's a really good one for funding.
I'm also thinking about how in this complex network of goals, actions, and funding strategies, it's great if doing one thing can have a positive effect on another thing we're trying to accomplish. And that reminds me of what Vikran mentioned early in his presentation, that twin set of goals, making a cleaner planet and a stronger economy. And I think what we're understanding here is that by focusing on building and renovation and energy poverty at the same time, if we combine them, then we've got also this twin focus in a way that solves 2 problems at the same time. We have time for 1 more question or a comment. Anna started a new class today and didn't think she could participate, but the teacher went through the syllabus and excused everyone. She decided to join us, and I'm hoping that she signs in with a question or comment along the way, because I'm so happy that she's with us.
I don't have a question, but I think it's really, his presentation is really good. It has a lot of like links and stuff. And I think each slide has enough information where it's not too much and not too little as well. So that's a little comment.
I'm going to take that, Anna, as a reminder for us to keep focusing on that 222 assignment. Take notes indicating two things that you think are very positive, two things that might need more improvement, and ask two questions. And I'm asking you to submit email, including that for each presentation we're hearing, as a way of motivating each of us to think a little bit more about tweaking our PowerPoint presentation and doing final revision for our reports, our written reports. We're now coming up on 11:30 Eastern Daylight Time, and it's time to hear from Lingfei about circular economy. Lingfei, please share your screen, and the floor is
Yep.
yours.
Okay, thank you. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
You might go,
Wait.
oh, there you go. Very good.
Good. Hi everyone, and I'm Lingfei. I'm a senior econ student in our school, and my focus is on the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. First of all, we can look at the goals. The new action plan announced initiatives along the entire life cycle of products, like targeting, for example, their design, promoting circular economy process, fostering sustainable consumption, and aiming to ensure that the resources are used to keep in the EU economy for as long as possible. And there are several measures to keep the EU Commission launch the activity, like achieve their goals, which is also called as a sustainable product policy framework. The first goal, the first action they want to do is the EU will make sustainable product the norm in the EU. And here comes the new concept is the upcircle, which will help the EU to make their goals to achieve. And the EU initiatives and the legislation already address to certain extent sustainability aspect of the product, and which also help to make the sustainable products works. And next is they want to empower consumers and the public buyers to help achieve the goals. Next is about the EU is going to focus on the sectors that use the most resources and where the potential for circularity is high, such as like electronics and ICT. The ICT is the information and the communication technology, which is a really important aspect in the sustainability economies. And also they have like other aspects like bacteria and verticals or packagings in the rest are listed on the PowerPoint. So when they want to achieve these goals, there's other goals like ensuring less waste and lead global efforts on circular economies. So in order to achieve their goals, their finance are mainly come from two parts. The first part is the EU funds, like for example, the EU cohesion funds, the European regulation development funds, and another part of funding up from private financing, for example, like InvestEU. And here's are the links for each these fundings. And so here comes the strengths and weakness for the financing. The strengths, I think, we can see from two parts. The first part is for the business. I think like new opportunities in the EU will be like it's the strength for the business, because building on the single market and the potential of digital technologies, the circular economies can strengthen the EU's industrial base and the foster business creation and also the entrepreneurship among the SMEs. So for the citizens, the economies will provide high quality, functional and safe products, which are efficient and affordable, last long, and are designed for the reuse, repair, and also for the high quality recycling. And so all these strengths contribute to reducing both EU's carbon and the material footprints. And also it has some weakness. The first weakness is I mentioned before that it is really hard to monitoring the fundings. And the second one is I think if we want to achieve these goals, and we need to like cooperate with other economies, like these goals can only success if its effort drives also the global transition. And for the best practice, I think I found a like really good example case for it. Accelerating the green transition like requires carefully and decision measure to steer financing towards are the sustainable product and the consumption patterns. So here's the example case is the EU text notation regulation. The Commission has already taken a series of initiatives in the respect, including integrating the circular economy objects under the EU text notation regulation and carry out preparation work on EU economical criteria for financial products. This example case can give a really good aspect for us to see how the EU Commission tried to achieve the circular economy goals. And that's all for my presentation today. And do you guys have any questions?
Thank you very much, Lingfei. I want to thank all of you. So far, you're staying well within your time limits and giving us an opportunity to ask questions and perhaps add comments. We have several minutes available now, and who would like to begin?
I can begin. So for one of the actions taken, you mentioned changing to more sustainable products as part of their plan, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so make sustainable products the norm. And I know one of the biggest things right now is like the increased use of plastics, especially like single-use plastics. So do you know if they're like, how is that going to affect the use of plastics in production for products?
For me, like I think that's a really good question. Like I think like maybe 18% of the product like environmental impacts are determined as the design phases. So like when we try to make the sustainable product the norm in the EU, what we do is to try to give them the standard to follow. I know like they set up a new, like just you mentioned, like the plastics like standard in 2019, and that's only just to help like maybe designer peoples to have a standard to follow, but we cannot like how to say like force them to do it. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, it does. Like I realized it's like I just wanted to know like maybe through researching if you like found out more about it, because there's two ways: either use less plastic or use more plastic to make things more reusable. You know.
Yeah, that's really a good point. But like for my research, I just found like they said that's the most part determined how this product is environmental or not is like depends on the designers, things like that. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to offer a comment based on everyday life in Austria, where when we go to the grocery store and package the groceries we buy, now really can't use plastic bags for our packaging. And also when we're walking through the store, we're seeing fewer and fewer plastic packages and more paper packages. And that all is influenced by EU legislation, reducing the use of plastics in the economy. But I want to suggest, if we think about this too, it's a case study where we might think of three options for action. And one is, as we've discussed, creating incentives. Another is creating disincentives. And the third option is to use mandates. And I would guess that all three of those are in play in the attempt in the European Union to reduce the use of plastics and also to incentivize the recycling of plastics and using them in products. That may be something to investigate just a little bit further for the final report, Lingfei. It's probably something that is complex with a wealth of information out there. And I think you're right to point to things like the initiative from 2019. Perhaps there are others that you could look at. We have a second question or a comment.
I have a question. I'm curious how, if you read anything or found anything that talks about how the EU circular economy is viewing imports into the country and kind of how they, how imports play a role in a circular economy, and if, kind of how, are there, I guess, guidelines on what can be imported into the EU, or kind of how that relates, if that makes sense.
You mean like how the circular economy action plan are works in EU?
Yeah, and how they, if they have regulations about what can be imported into a circular economy, because their goal is, to recycle and reuse kind of what can be. And so if they have rules about importing sustainably produced products, or how, if they kind of connect those two, or if the circular economy is focusing just on products that are made and produced in the EU.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Like, I think they have because they already have a standard for the products they produce, and I believe they also have the standard for the products they gonna import. That's a good aspect. I think I gonna do more work on it, because for now I don't have any, how to say, info about if they have any standard or something on the import things, but I think they have, because this circular economy, I don't think it's just in EU, or I mean they need to make the connection with other countries and the countries outside the EU. So they definitely need have this kind of things to make sure the sustainable products in the EU things. Yeah.
I'd like to add that is a fascinating topic. On the one hand, in the process of globalization for the past several decades, we've been hearing over and over again how important it is to have open borders with no protectionism and as few trade tariffs as possible, even with the World Trade Organization being responsible for monitoring the fair and free trade across borders. But right now, just within the last couple of weeks, I've been hearing increasingly about the need to try, in the interest of circular economies, to create and consume products within the boundaries of countries and regions. And it is the case, and I think fairly easy to find in current media, references to things that we used to call something like protectionism. And now it's sounding more as though it is perceived not as something that is negative, but could be perceived as positive, creating tariffs and taxation on the imports of goods with the idea in mind of creating revenue, also that could be used to increase the circularity within the boundaries of a community, be it a nation or something like the European Union. And if there is international or global cooperation, it could be something that would be coordinated so that all of the members of the global community would agree that it's a good thing and would agree to harmonize it in ways that would make it beneficial for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've actually been hearing similar things recently, which has been interesting because I think, yeah, there's been a lot of talk of how, yeah, globalization has led to, in terms of environmental issues, this like race to the bottom and kind of where can we produce goods that have the fewest environmental regulations because that will be the cheapest. And so how that has also led to environmental degradation, and how can we, you know, produce, because so many of those countries that produce to export also import a lot of what they use. And so how can they, kind of create what they need in that country. So anyway, yeah, it's just interesting. It's not considered, protectionism as much anymore.
I'm going to transition to virtual transitions with Reagan's presentation, also by citing a headline in the news right now. There is one of the super container ships stuck in the Suez Canal right now, and it's creating a container ship traffic jam that is leading to a short-term price increase for oil worldwide. That is something that likely will be cited in the next 24, 48, 72 hours in this news cycle as evidence that it's important to look for ways to increase circular economy activity so that we don't have to rely so much on something like the Suez Canal and Panama Canal working without any challenges, because when there are challenges, then it can lead to greater costs and big difficulties. See, for example, images of that ship and what is being done right now to try to loosen it so that we can stop the traffic jam. Having said that, let's complete the transition. Thank you very much, Lingfei, and we'll go to Reagan with just transitions.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the just transition mechanism within the European Green Deal. So first I want to talk about what some of the goals are of a just transition and what that concept is, which is pretty much addressing how do we transition to a carbon neutral world that is renewable and sustainable, but do so in a just and equitable way. And so the goals of the European Green Deal Just Transition Mechanism are to first transition to a climate neutral economy in a fair way, making sure that nobody is left behind, not increasing social inequity through the process. And then second fold is to alleviate the socioeconomic impact of this upcoming and current transition on the most affected regions in the European Union. And so to do this, they are mobilizing 150 billion euros in the budgetary period of 2021 to 2027 by focusing on regions, industries, and workers, which we are going to talk more about. So to achieve these goals, the Just Transition Mechanism is focusing on these kind of three different scopes. So at the largest scale are the regions and the member states, and then industries and companies, and then at the smallest scale are individual people and workers. So at the regional scale, this is done by creating new green jobs, investing in things like sustainable transport and renewable energy sources, and providing affordable loans to local public authorities in these regions. At the industry and company level, this is going to be done by supporting this transition to low carbon technologies through financing and assistance. And then as well, creating attractive conditions for investors to invest in specific low carbon industries and companies in these regions. And then third, to provide easier access to loans and financial support. And then finally, at the smallest scope of people and workers is facilitating employment opportunities in these new sectors, offering reskilling opportunities for workers who previously were in a carbon heavy industry. Third, investing to fight energy poverty, which we heard a little bit about. And then finally, to facilitate access to clean, affordable, and secure energy. So to do all of these, to complete these actions, there is a lot of funding that is going to be needed. And so the Just Transition Mechanism looks primarily at these three options to mobilize money and investments to the regions, industries, and people who need it the most. So the primary finance action is the new Just Transition Fund, which has been created, which has 40 billion euros that they hope to generate between 89 and 107 billion euros of investments through that. The second one is the Invest EU Just Transition Scheme, which aims to mobilize 30 billion euros in investments. And then third is the loan facility through the European Investment Bank, which is 10 billion euros in loans backed by 1.5 billion euros of the EU budget, and then that together mobilizing up to about 30 billion euros of investments. So in total, they are aiming to mobilize at least 150 billion euros through these various finance actions. So some of the strengths and weaknesses in the Just Transition Mechanism that I saw, there are many strengths. Primarily, I think a thorough analysis of where funding will come from, the fact that it's not all coming from one place, but it's slightly diversified through private and public assets. And then also the idea of offering technical support through the Just Transition Platform and the Territorial Just Transition Plan. So both of these are providing an advisory role to regions that need assistance, and the goal is to produce tailored solutions that work for these individual entities. Some of the weaknesses are the potential of countries that must match each euro they receive from the Just Transition Fund. So it's a little bit confusing, but in the 40 billion euros of the Just Transition Fund, there is 10 billion euros that is directly from the budget. And so to receive that 10 billion euros, countries match each euro that they receive of that with 1.5 to 3 euros of their own money from the European Regional Development Fund, the ERDF, and the European Social Fund Plus. So it potentially could limit countries that need the funding more than others with that matching, but I think it also has a potential to be a strength. And then secondly, the potential just for not enough funds to meet all of the goals has been discussed because it's a broad initiative and they have a lot of different goals and plans. And so although 150 billion euros is a significant amount of money, given what they hope to accomplish, it has potential for not being enough to accomplish all of that. In terms of some best practices for Just Transition, these are intentionally fairly broad because I think that they can give us ideas of how they can be applied in other contexts, such as the US or other countries for that matter. But in terms of communication, some of the most important ones are participation of specifically those who are the most affected. And so relying on their experiences, their firsthand knowledge in developing new and re-employment plans is very important to do whatever it takes to make sure that the solutions that you are coming up with are actually addressing the problems that people are experiencing. Second, in funding is to make sure that investments and subsidies are focused on public services and environmentally friendly industries is important. And so funds should go towards the redevelopment of affected communities, and that should be the primary and kind of the first, most important place. In terms of technology, the example of the Just Transition platform and their goal to provide tailored technological solutions to areas and industries that need it, and that providing that advisory role. And then finally in policy, to create legislation that provides certainty, but also built-in flexibility. So they could be seen as in conflict, but the idea is to have people aware and have initiatives that people can count on, but also recognizing that there is a lot that we don't know. And so legislation and policy needs to be flexible. Second, to provide a clear link between closing coal plants and investments in wind and solar. And so this was something that I found, just the importance of people seeing that it's not just we're closing and getting rid of these jobs, but here is a new job and a new industry, and making that link very clear to people. And then the last policy best practice is to begin Just Transition work early, because the reality is that we are in the middle of our energy transition. And so we need to, from the beginning, make sure it's as just and equitable as possible. So that's all I have for the Just Transition mechanism, but would be happy to answer a few questions.
And I would like to begin by asking not only Reagan, but everybody, please raise your hand. Who has class in 2 minutes? Vikran, and the rest of you could stay on a little bit longer. That's great. I'm going to then excuse Vikram. Thank you very much for your presentation. As always, look for an email message from me to everyone tomorrow I'd like those of you who can stay on a little bit longer to do so, and we'll ask questions of Reagan and then also see Anna's presentation. All right. Who would like to ask a first question or make a comment about Reagan's presentation? Chris, it has been a little bit since you've contributed, so I would like not to put you on the spot, but to ask if there's anything you'd like to say or a question you might have.
Me?
Christian.
Oh, sorry, I was looking at my notes for presentation.
I don't really have a question, but I thought the presentation was really well overall. Like, she explained everything well enough to where I was able to understand everything that she brought up, but she didn't go like too in depth to where it was taking up too much time. And I felt like I understood her presentation really well.
There is something new in Reagan's presentation, and that was in the best practices slide, attempt to remain somewhat general, thinking about making recommendations that can be used in the United States, in the transatlantic partnership, and also with the idea in mind that some of what we are discovering might be replicable globally and trigger tipping points. Reagan, I'm going to put you on the spot. I haven't asked anybody this question today, but it's something that I want everyone to think about as we move into our final week. Is there anything that you see in the just transition category, or actually in any of the presentations we have seen today, that suggest potential for one of those magical tipping points that can get us on track to achieve the Paris Agreement goals?
That's a good question. This is what came to mind, and it's, I think, maybe slightly a different approach, but I think something that has, I think, unlocked potential that could help us get to a tipping point, but slightly what I addressed in my presentation, but this idea of participation and including voices from people who historically have not been represented in these types of conversations. And so I think there's a lot of unlocked or unaccessed knowledge in some of these populations of people that, historically have not been maybe given a seat at the table, or aren't maybe considered to have classic kind of what we consider as knowledge, kind of in academia is kind of, I think, how we typically look at knowledge. So I think just some of our processes and kind of rethinking them so that we can have as many voices and as much knowledge as we try to address probably the largest issue in recent history.
I want to pick up on that, paraphrase a little bit, and add some concrete contours, and think about places like Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia and Poland, and places where the coal industry remains something that is a big part of the economy, although I think everywhere coal is slowly but surely failing. And if we want the citizens of those places, and that's just one example, as stakeholders in the European Green Deal, or in something like the Green Deal in the United States, to play a really active role and to push their representatives to make sure that everything that we're talking about is not just something that exists on paper but is being implemented. If we can follow your guideline to get started with the just transition as quickly as possible, it's more likely that more citizens in the European Union, the United States, and elsewhere will buy into what is being undertaken and participate not only individually, but in pushing legislators, decision makers to speed it up a little bit. That could create a very, very fascinating tipping point. We have a final presentation today, which is going to be somewhat innovative. Our presenter is here, but was not planning to be here. And I'm going to play the presentation and at the end ask Anna to make 2 or 3 comments, kind of concluding the presentation.
Hello everyone, my name is Anna Valenzuela. I'm a junior here at the University of Illinois. I'm part of the European Green Deal Research Project. And my presentation today will be on the European Union's biodiversity strategy for 2030. So what are the goals of the biodiversity strategy for 2030? Well, it aims to put Europe's biodiversity on the path to recovery by 2030 for the benefit of people, climate, and the planet. It also aims to build our society's resilience to future threats, such as the impacts of climate change, forest fires, food insecurity, and disease outbreaks. This includes by protecting wildlife and fighting illegal wildlife trade. So how will they achieve the goals? They will establish protected areas for at least 30% of the land and 30% of the sea in Europe. This will be done through legally binding legislation. It will also restore degraded ecosystems at land and sea across the whole of Europe by increasing organic farming and biodiversity-rich landscapes, features on agricultural land, halting and reversing the decline of pollinators, reducing the use and harmfulness of pesticides by 50% by 2030, restoring at least 25,000 kilometers of European Union's rivers to a free-flowing state, and planting 3 billion trees by 2030. It will also enlarge existing Natura 2000 areas, which strict protection for areas of very high biodiversity and climate value. And it will also launch an European Union's Nature Restoration Plan, which targets in 2021 will provide stricter protection for EU forests. So how will these actions be financed? Well, out of the 30% of the EU budget that's dedicated to climate action, a significant proportion will be invested in biodiversity and nature-based solutions. Also unlocking about 20 billion euros per year for biodiversity through various sources, including EU funds and national and private funding. Natural capital and biodiversity considerations will be integrated into business practices, and the EU is also working towards the ambition of dedicating about 7.5% of the 2021 to 2027 multi-annual financial framework to biodiversity objectives as of 2024, and then increasing it to 10% by 2026. So what are the strengths and weaknesses of the actions and financings? Well, some of the strengths include that the strategy states its goals clearly and very openly. They're very easy to find and they're very clear. It also takes into account many factors that could cause a decrease in biodiversity. They also include its economic effects, And another strength would be that, just by having the biodiversity strategy is a strength in and of itself, as restoring biodiversity is important in the fight against climate change, as many animals and organisms rely on a healthy environment. And we rely on these animals and organisms and the environment for the human species to thrive. But it also has its weaknesses. For example, the timeline of 2030 might mean that many ecosystems will get weaker and or die by 2030, as we can see some of the effects already. And it also lacks accountability for not meeting their goals. The EU also had a biodiversity strategy for 2020, and it had very ambitious goals, and it did not meet many of the 2020 strategy's goals. So if they don't meet the goals for 2030, they might just move them for the next biodiversity strategy, regardless of how much time we actually have to do that. What are some of its best practices? In terms of policies, they have a lot of directives and legislations and regulations that they plan on passing. For example, the bird directive protects birds, habitat directive protects habitats, zoos directives, it regulates the roles of zoos in the conservation of biodiversity. Invasive alien species regulation regulates invasive species, and wildlife trade legislations fights against the illegal wildlife trading. A big thing in policy is also the Natura 2000, which is a network of core breeding and resting sites for rare and threatened species. And its benefits have been estimated to be about 200 to 300 billion per year so far. Natura 2000 was also a part of the biodiversity strategy for 2020. And as I mentioned before, for the 2030 biodiversity strategy, they will just make it, they will expand on it. So best practices in communications, they have released a list of the threatened species within Europe, so that you can see which species are the most threatened, so that scientists can see all this, and it's open to the public. In terms of technology, they're trying out nature-based solutions, which is just technology. It's just using nature to help combat environmental challenges instead of just focusing solely on technology. So there's the Enable, which improves green and blue infrastructure in cities. Grow Green, embedding nature-based solutions in cities. Network Nature, Sincere, Terra Nova, We Value Nature, and IUCN Urban Alliance.
Anna, there you are. Would you like to offer concluding remarks?
Yeah, I'm on mute. Yeah, so thank you for watching the presentation. I kind of cut off. I didn't realize it was gonna just end recording before I could conclude it. But yeah, biodiversity, I feel like it's very important, and it affects a lot of other stuff. It's very intersectional. I think that's what it is. And so I really appreciate that they're also putting a lot of emphasis on biodiversity, because I think without it, we really can't do much in terms of global warming, climate change, and all that. So yes, thank you for watching.
I'd like to thank you also for mentioning again that it's important to accelerate the implementation of directives, regulations, the action plans that you highlighted, because the clock is ticking. And as you suggested, there are species at a rapid pace that are becoming extinct right now. And to say that we are going to accomplish something by 2030 might be too late for some aspects of our biodiversity that we consider essential. And it's really not the case that we can simply say, oh, well, we'll just continue on to 2040 or 2050. In many cases, we are very, very aware of how the clock is ticking and that sooner than later, it's going to be too late. Would anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment as we slowly but surely come to the end of our session today? Yes, Lingfei.
I'm thinking about question like, do you know like what's the main reason for them to fail to meet the like 2020 goals? As you mentioned in the weakness part, they failed to meet the goals, right? Do you know what's the reason? It's because of the COVID or?
So for 2020, I believe it's just because it's like hard. In terms, okay, I saw the article that I cited in the presentation like a while ago. So out of memory, I think it's just because like they didn't really implement or like they didn't follow through with the stuff that they said they were going to do. So because they didn't follow through, the goals were not met. If any specifics, I can't think about it. Like I can't remember it like right now on the spot, but I believe that's like the main reason.
I'd like to offer 3 potential reasons why the goals weren't reached. And these may be reasons why often goals aren't reached. One was that between 2010 and 2020, we were dealing with another economic crisis. And in the meantime, many of us have more or less forgotten about it. But in the European Union, I'm not even sure that everyone, including decision makers, would say that we had overcome the financial budget economic crisis that started around 2010. That might be one reason for blocking resources that may have been intended to achieve some of the goals. Before mentioning any others, would any others of you like to speculate what factors might have led to the goals not being reached, the ones for the 2020 plan? Put on your thinking cap. I'll offer a second, and while I'm doing that, listen, but try to think perhaps of a third. Another would be possibly a failing to perceive their urgency, which is perhaps more prevalent now than it was 10 years ago, although many of us might say it was plenty urgent 10 years ago, and now it is increasingly urgent, which ought to give us more of a chance to reach the goals by 2030. Would someone like to consider perhaps a third factor? Why weren't the goals for 2020 reached? I'm going to offer a third factor and tie it into your silence on this issue, and that is because people like us, the citizens of the European Union, or in our case, citizens of the United States, or whatever community it is to which we belong, we weren't aware of the goals, or if we were aware, we were busy with other things, and it's really essential that the citizens push their leaders to implement and to achieve the goals that they set for themselves. And that means as we look at each other moving toward 2030, whether it be in the United States, the European Union, or in the global community, if the goals are achieved, it's likely because we have been participating and pushing for that to take place. That may be a good place to stop for today. I'd like to encourage all of you to look for a message from me tomorrow with activities for our final meeting next Friday, focusing on tweaking our PowerPoint presentations one last time and revising our final written reports which we will talk about during our meeting on next Thursday. And in doing that, I think we're going to focus on best practices and understand what we can do to encourage the European Union, the United States, the transatlantic partnership, and the global community in our 4 key categories to do everything possible to create tipping points so that we do achieve the Paris Agreement goals for 2050. Thank you all for participating today. We'll be in touch.
Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.